These are the best tips and tricks for players who are new to the Lord of the Rings LCG. Now, if you'd like to learn how to play this game, I've got a video linked up here in the corner of the screen, and all of my Lord of the Rings videos are linked in the description below. I'm going to split these tips up into 6 major buckets. So I'm going to have all of these time-stamped below so you can skip to any topic that most interests you, but let's get started. All right, to start us off, tip number 1 is to learn your action windows. This is actually the most complicated part of the rules in the game because there are so many different steps in each round and so many opportunities you have to play actions that it can get just a little bit hazy when you're starting out. But there are some excellent resources online that have already taught new players for a long time on how to do this. So rather than just repeat what all of those folks have already put together, I'm going to add links to the description below to all of those amazing resources about action windows. But you can also find this in detail in the rules reference that comes with the revised core set. It's on page 20 of the rules reference. It looks like this. It shows you in detail with all of these red boxes where the action windows are, and you can see a bunch on this side too. So it's extremely helpful to have this open as you're playing your first few games so you can really get comfortable with when you can play actions and when you can't. The next thing you should know is that this game is hard. It's really hard, but it's fun because when you finally overcome that challenge, it feels amazing because it was so difficult. But losing is a part of the experience. So the best advice people give is that when you lose, analyze why you lost. Did you fail the questing phase too many times? Well, then maybe you need to put some more willpower in your deck, some characters with a higher willpower. Did you engage too many enemies too early? Well, then maybe your threat cost is too high on your heroes. So maybe you need to pick some heroes with a lower threat cost. They're not going to be as strong, but you can avoid enemies for a longer period of time. Maybe that's the problem. Did you not have enough cards to play with a pile of resources? Well, then maybe you need to add more card draw. Or the opposite, maybe you had no resources and too many cards. Then you should add some resource acceleration cards into your deck. The point is that you can fix any problem in a deck. You just have to really think about what your deck needs, why you lost, then make some tweaks and try again. Think of it like a puzzle to solve and have fun. Easy mode is not for wimps, okay? Easy mode is still difficult, but I hate that they call it easy mode. It should honestly be called something like small card pool mode because the game gets easier as your card pool grows because you get more options to face all the challenges in each quest. So when you start with a small card pool, it's totally legitimate to just play on this easy mode because it can be way more enjoyable for people. So to set it up, it's really easy. You just look through the encounter deck and take out all the encounter cards that have a gold circle around them, and then because those are the most difficult cards, and then you add 1 extra resource to each of your heroes at the beginning. Now, if you feel that makes it too easy, you can just choose one of those things. You can add the extra resources or thin out the encounter deck and take out the gold circled ones. Just play for enjoyment. Play whatever way works best for you. But as you're starting out, I would recommend just trying easy mode to begin with. And if you are steamrolling quests, then change it up and go up to normal mode from there. You should know that the game is best balanced for 2 players. Okay, now this is still one of the greatest solo games ever made. Most people that buy this game play it solo with 1 deck. But you should know that there's some things that you miss when you just play with 1 deck. First of all, there's some keywords on heroes and allies that have ranged and sentinel that can help each other in the combat phase. So there's a whole cooperative element that's amazing in this game that you miss if you just play it solo one-handed. Second of all, though, the encounter deck tends to be a little less consistent if you're only drawing 1 card each round. Playing 2-player where you draw 2 cards each round, you get to see a lot of the combos that were designed in the quest, and it's sort of a fuller experience, more consistent and more balanced experience that way. So the other thing though is that when you're only playing with 1 deck, it's actually much more difficult to build a deck that can do everything, because you have to quest, attack, and defend with 1 deck in a solo game versus in a 2-player game. You can kind of assign roles and have specialties where each player can cover different aspects of the game. So it's a little easier in that sense when you're playing 2 players. So all that to say, if you play this game solo, try it 2-handed so that you basically play a 2-player game with 2 decks by yourself. it's a lot of fun because you get the full experience of the game. You get the encounter deck combos, you get the deck synergies that can work together. It is more to manage on the table, so it can be a little bit crunchier of an experience. So if you don't like that, that's fine. Solo one-handed is still perfectly doable. You should just know that there are maybe 3 quests out of all the quests in the game that are almost impossible to beat solo one-handed. That would be Escape from Dol Guldur from the core set, unfortunately, although campaign mode fixed that. The 3 trials from the 4th cycle, and then Return to Mirkwood from the 1st cycle. Okay, those quests are just not designed for solo one-handed play. All right, let's get to some buying advice for this game. The most common question we see on the Facebook group and the subreddit for this game are, what should I buy next? After you get the core set, where do you go from there? It's really a complicated question because we're in the middle of a resurgence, a re-release of the game into a brand new format, but there's still 135 expansions available in the old format. So what do you get and where can you get it? So I'm actually going to be making a buyer's guide video that will explain all of these different products to you, make that a lot easier hopefully for you. I'll link to that in the bottom of in the description below, but also in the corner of the screen up here when that's finished. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. Here's just some starting tips for you that should be very safe recommendations right now. The Dark of Mirkwood is an excellent buy for new players. It comes with 2 quests inside that are easier than most quests, so they're easy for new players to get into. But you can also play them as a little mini campaign with some boons and burdens you can earn depending on how you perform. It's a lot of fun, but you can also link these 2 quests to the 3 quests in the core set to play a 5 quest campaign, which again is even more fun. You can carry all those boons together. Now, I won't spoil anything in here, but the boons you can unlock in this pack are really, really good. I had a lot of fun playing this, so excellent buy for new players. Now, the 4 new starter decks are also a great buy for new players because they give you a deck in a box that you can just play right away and have a good time with, but they also have a ton of great general use cards that you can use to build a wide variety of decks. Now, if you plan to buy all the content for this game, these cards are duplicates. There's no brand new cards in here, but if you're just planning to buy the new repackaged cycles that are coming out, there won't be any duplicates in these, at least for the next 3 cycles that will be released. So excellent way to jump into the game. Highly recommend. I will also post a link to the video I just did that does an unboxing and a full card-by-card analysis of what's in these decks if you're curious to see what's inside and some of my thoughts on them. The Lord of the Rings Saga expansions are some of the best expansions available for this game. There are 6 of these for the Lord of the Rings Saga, and then there's 2 of them for The Hobbit. These follow the story of the books, all the way from Frodo leaving the Shire to throwing the ring into Mount Doom. Now, these are all technically standalone expansions, meaning you don't have to buy them or play them in order to play the content inside. But if you do start from the first box, the Black Riders expansion, you can play them together as a campaign. If you plan to buy expansions from one of the 9 cycles in the game, then don't buy a partial cycle. Try to get a complete cycle all at once. Okay, there's a lot of reasons for this. I'll go into it in more detail in my buyer's guide video. But essentially, we don't know which cycles are going to get repackaged in the 2-box format and which ones will keep being reprinted as the old format. So if you get a partial cycle now, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to complete that cycle later without buying duplicates in the repackaged 2-box format. So if you do buy those cycle contents, try to get a complete cycle all at once. All right, next, let me share some tips with you about using the starter decks listed in the rulebook. This is on page 5. There are 4 starter decks that they recommend you start out with. And these are monosphere decks, meaning they use all of the cards from just one color. So the leadership deck uses all the purple cards, plus a couple copies of Gandalf. That's probably the best deck for a solo player to start with, and you can expect to win a decent amount of time. The tactics deck is the worst. Okay, it looks awesome because you've got Legolas and Gimli, some amazing heroes, but there's almost no willpower in the deck, which you need to win quests. So again, if you're just playing these as a solo player, don't expect to win with the tactics deck. The others are fine, okay. I've been able to beat the first quest with them just fine, but If you play multiplayer, say if you play a 4-player game, these can perform much better because then all the decks can cover each other's weaknesses. But just be aware as a solo player, that tactics deck is not good at all. All right, and the other reason these starter decks are so bad is that they ask you to include 3 copies of every single card. Okay, let me explain why this is a bad idea. There are 3 types of cards that are difficult to play. The first is a card like this. This is Bjorn's Hospitality. It costs 5, and it's a powerful effect. You get to heal all damage on every hero controlled by that player, but it costs 5, and so you're not going to be able to play this very often. So the starter deck comes with 3 copies of that. If you draw all 3 of these in your hand, you're not going to be able to play all of them, so they're going to clog up your hand. Now, likewise, a card like this, Fortune or Fate, lets you resurrect a hero from the dead, which is pretty cool again, but it's situational. You're not going to be playing many games where a hero dies, so you may never have a situation where you get to play this card. So having, again, 3 copies of that in your deck isn't a good idea. And lastly, there are cards like Brock Iron Fist that are unique. Right here, this little symbol on the card there, that star, means that it is a named character that you can only have 1 copy on the table at a time. So if you have 3 copies in your deck and you only ever need to play 1 of them, then you're out of luck and you're clogging up your hand again. Now, it turns out too, Brock Iron Fist is kind of regarded as the worst card in the game because he's all 3 of these things. He's expensive at 6, he's situational with his ability, and he's unique. So he's just not really great to play overall. Now, as a fun little exercise, you can actually try to improve the core set decks by removing cards that are unique, situational, or too expensive. Okay, try to get the decks down to maybe 25 to 30 cards. That's going to make a better deck for a friend if you give it to them to play with, and it's a fun deck building exercise. After playing with those monosphere decks, just to get familiar with the cards, I would highly recommend you try out these pre-built decks on page 27 of the rulebook. These were designed by Caleb, the lead designer of the game, and they're excellent. Okay, the Leadership Spirit deck at the top there is excellent for solo play, but both decks are designed to work together. In a 2-player game or in a 2-handed solo game, they're a lot of fun, and they can beat all of the quests in the core set. I've tried. And lastly, it's not cheating to use a deck that someone else has built. This is a cooperative game, so just have fun. I'm going to post a couple of really strong solo decks in the description below, and reading the description on those decks will also give you a good idea for all the combos available in the core set, some of the really cool card interactions in there. So have fun. All right, now let me move into giving you some tips about the quests in the core set. Now, this first tip is sort of a general tip for most quests, okay? Don't rush questing. Don't commit so many of your characters to the quest that you miss out on the combat and the defense aspects of the game, okay? That's one of the common mistakes for new players, I would say. Take your time and build up your board state, okay? You're going to be able to make steady progress as you get more allies and attachments on the table so you can build up your board state first. Then start questing. Most quests in the game don't have a strict timer. Some do, where you really need to push the questing early, but most don't. So take your time and build up your board state first. The second quest in the core set, Journey Along the Anduin, has a challenge that at first seems insurmountable. You'll know what I'm talking about when you see it. It's right at the beginning of the quest. But there are a lot of solutions for overcoming that problem. So I don't want to spoil it for you because this is half the fun in the game, is trying to build a deck that can overcome the challenges that a quest throws at you. Okay, so don't be discouraged if it seems like unbelievably impossible. There are solutions. You just have to analyze it and look through the cards in the core set and see what you might be able to use to face that challenge. And now, well, for me, it's one of my favorite quests, but for you, after you beat it, I think it will be one of your favorites too. Now, the third quest in the core set, Escape from Dol Guldur, was not designed for solo play. For one deck, it's almost impossible to beat, except in campaign mode. Okay, in the new revised core set, if you play the campaign mode, I actually had a lot of fun playing it solo. They fixed a lot of the design that was lacking there for a solo player that actually then makes it less frustrating and more of just a fun challenge, for me at least. So I was able to beat the quest with that recommended leadership and spirit deck from the rulebook. So it is very possible to beat it solo using that recommended deck. I'd say it's still fun, and it is easier the more players you add, but just, take that. I would not recommend playing solo without campaign mode in that third quest, okay? Either play campaign mode or play two-handed or just, play multiplayer. That'll make that quest a lot more fun. All right, now let's get into some deck building tips. The rulebook will tell you that a standard deck size is 50 cards. Okay, that generally speaking is the minimum you should use. However, if you just have a core set, ignore that rule completely. Don't build decks with 50 cards if you just have the core set. Okay, I would recommend building decks maybe around 30 to 35 cards. It is way more interesting to deck build with that restriction than it is to try to force 50 cards in a deck when you don't have that many options. As your card pool grows, then you can work your way up to that 50 card deck limit. I'd say after maybe getting 1 or 2 cycles of player cards, you should be able to build 50 card decks no problem. But just starting out, I'd recommend that kind of 30 card sweet spot. It'll make it a lot more fun for you. Another standard tip for deck building is, at least at the beginning, try to make your deck consist of at least half allies. Okay, so if you build a 30 card deck, try to include at least 15 ally cards. If you're building a 50 card deck, try to aim for about 25 allies. The reason why is that allies are the cards that will help you with the main aspects of the game best, the questing, attacking, and defending, and they stay on the table as long as they don't die. So the allies are what's going to let you ramp up your board state to win quests in the end. Attachments do that too, but I think allies do that much better, especially in the early card pool. Next, you should pay attention to the resource curve in your deck. This means you should pay attention to what your cards cost. So what I recommend doing is you kind of break down your deck and put it in piles sorted by the cost. So you should have a pile of 0 cost, 1 cost cards, 2 cost cards. Those should be the majority of your deck. And then the 3 cost cards, 4 and 5 cost cards should be much less in your deck. You shouldn't have as many of the expensive cards because it's less efficient and you're not going to be able to do as much if many of your cards are expensive. Okay, so that's something to pay attention to. Try to put most of your cards on the low cost end. Next, you should know that card draw is the most important effect in the game. It's the most powerful because the more cards you have in your hand, the more options you have to face all the challenges the encounter deck is going to throw at you. If you only have 1 or 2 cards in your hand, you just don't have the options to play something as often as you need to win quests. So that makes in the core set, some of the best cards are Hero Barivore, who can draw 2 cards every round, Gleowine, who can draw a card every round, and Gandalf, who can draw you 3 cards when you play him, and then I believe it's Valiant Sacrifice in Leadership that you can draw 2 cards if an ally leaves play. It's a great card as well. So card draw is super important. Try to include that in a deck as much as you can. Next, if you're a solo player playing with just one deck, you need to have enough willpower. Okay, make sure to include enough allies that can quest for you. That is the biggest challenge in a solo game. And lastly, if you'd like to add some variety to your deck building without having to buy any new expansions, you can play with the rules from one of the contracts from the last cycle. It's called the Messenger of the King contract. Again, you don't need to own this card to play by the rules of it. It just changes how you set up the game. So what you do is you pick a unique ally from your collection, someone like Gleowine from the core set or Faramir from the core set, and you add up the stats of that ally, and that becomes the threat cost. So Faramir, if you add up all the stats, becomes an 8 threat cost hero, which is respectable, but you get his amazing ability as a hero right from the beginning, which is amazing. And someone like Gleowine, this would be quite interesting to deck build with, because you add up the stats and it becomes a 3 threat cost hero, which is one of the lowest in the entire game. But you get to use Gleowine's card draw effect right from the beginning as a hero. So really interesting to provide some variety in building some decks without needing to expand your card pool. Now the only restriction from that contract is that you can only ready the character once per phase. So basically, that rule was put in place specifically for Faramir to make sure you couldn't repeat his +1 willpower ability over and over and over again. So you can only ready the character once per phase from that. But it's not a huge deal. It's a lot of fun to play with, and I hope you try it out. All right, next we're going to move into talking about some common rules mistakes. I polled the Facebook community to ask what are the most common rules that are missed by new players, and these are the top results that they gave me, so here we go. First, you can't play allies or attachments outside of the planning phase. This is important because you can't just play an ally whenever you want, unless you play a card like Stand and Fight, which lets you put an ally into play during another phase in the game, but that's a different situation. Normally, the planning phase is the one opportunity you have to play those ally and attachments from your hand. Next is many players ignore the unique symbol on many of the cards in the core set. A card like Steward of Gondor is a title that's unique. So there can only be one Steward of Gondor on the table at a time. So you're not allowed to play 2 copies on the table. When you reveal shadow cards from enemies, you can ignore all of the main part of the text on that card. All you're looking for is anything that's below that line and then the effect that says shadow on it. That's the only thing you're paying attention to. So if it doesn't exist on the card, nothing happens. There's no shadow effect. Now this is a really common mistake. Don't miss this. Enemies that are engaged with you don't add their threat strength to the staging area during that questing phase. Okay, if you engage an enemy, that's threat strength that is being reduced in the staging area, so it will make questing easier for you. The same thing applies to the active location. When you travel to a location and it becomes the active location, that threat strength is no longer being added to the staging area. So that makes questing easier when you travel to a location. Another core concept that's often missed is that when you quest, attack, or defend with a character, a hero or an ally, you have to exhaust that character by turning them sideways. That means that you are no longer able to quest, defend, or attack with that character again. So generally speaking, you can only do one of those 3 things with each character each round. Okay, so that's really where the main decision points are in the game. You have to decide, who am I going to quest with? Who am I going to leave available to defend any enemy attacks? And then after I defend enemies, I still have to have some available ready characters that can attack the enemies. So this is a challenging game because it seems like at the beginning at least you're not going to be able to do everything. That's why you need to play more allies on the table so you can get more bodies there to do all of these 3 actions effectively. Alternatively, you can use a card effect that will ready a character so you can use them again for something else. The best example of this is Unexpected Courage, which is still one of the strongest cards in the game. It simply lets you ready a hero so you can do 2 things with them every round. Now this one's super important. You're not allowed to skip the quest phase. Okay, if you have a lot of enemies on the table and you think, okay, I'm not going to commit anyone to the quest, let's just focus on combat this time. Well, if you do that, you still have to do the staging step where you add an encounter card and you still compare the threat strength to all the willpower on your questing characters. So in the case where you don't quest with anyone, your willpower is 0. Compared to the threat strength in the staging area, you may be raising your threat by a lot. So you can't skip the questing phase. You always do staging and you always compare your willpower to that threat strength. So you should probably try to quest with someone at least every round if you can. All right, this next tip is really subtle but very important. There is a difference between revealing an encounter card and adding a card to the staging area. Okay, when you reveal an encounter card, all of the effects will trigger. The when revealed effects will trigger, the surge and doomed keywords will trigger. But when you add a card to the staging area, those things don't happen. Adding a card to the staging area will bypass any when revealed effects so they don't happen, and you ignore surge and doomed. Okay, so some quest cards will instruct you to add a card to the staging area. That's better than revealing it because you ignore a lot of the stuff that's on the card. Another important distinction is that playing a card is different than putting a card into play from your hand. Okay, so when you play a card, you have to pay all of the costs and account for all of the sphere restrictions. So if you play a spirit card, you have to pay for the cost with spirit heroes resources. But if you put a card into play, you don't pay any of the resource cost and you ignore any sphere restrictions. So Stand and Fight is a great example of this, where it lets you put a card into play, but you ignore the sphere restriction and the cost on the card. And lastly, engaging an enemy or being engaged by an enemy is the same thing. Okay, take Hummer Horns as an example from the core set. It says, after Hummer Horns engages you, deal 5 damage to a single hero you control. It kills a hero when it engages you. It doesn't matter though whether you choose to engage it or whether it engages you because you've reached 40 threat. It doesn't matter, it's the same event, so it's going to kill a hero no matter what, as soon as it engages you somehow. Be sure to check out these other Lord of the Rings videos I've got linked here on the screen. I've got a how to play video coming, so be sure to subscribe to not miss that. Now, if I missed any new player tips that you think someone else should know about, definitely post that in the comments below for everyone to see. Now, you've been watching The Game Locker. That's one word, The Game Locker. Thank you for watching. Godspeed.